candle smoke and hothouse lilies never quite cover the smell of snow, and Grace Ellsworth carried a breath of the cold night in on her plain gray shawl as she came late into the Duke of Wrenford's blazing ballroom. She stood at the edge of it, near the tall black windows where the snow was falling, and heard the man she had been promised to raise his voice to 300 people and tell them that a duke keeps his word to his equals. He believed he was quietly setting aside a penniless companion, a woman paid to read aloud to a half-blind old countess. He was setting aside the one person in the 3 counties who would ever read the whole truth of him to the end, and who would, before the snow was off the ground, hold the deed to the very house he was standing in. The ball at Wrenford Court that Christmas was the finest in the north, and every carriage of consequence for 40 miles had come sliding through the frozen lanes to see it. Because it was understood, half understood, whispered behind fans in the card-room, that the 4th Duke of Wrenford meant at last to name the woman he would marry. That was reckoned a great condescension in his grace. Julian, 4th Duke of Wrenford, was 31, dark and splendid, and made in the way that arranges a whole room around a single man, and everyone knew, or believed they knew, that he was to lower himself to marry a nobody, a portionless girl who lived on the charity of the Dowager Countess of Wexley and earned her bread reading to the old woman by candlelight. The wax that burned at Wrenford that night was a year of a curate's living, spent to say that such a marriage would be a gift the county should admire. What the blazing candles did not show, because candlelight is kind to surfaces and to nothing else, was that the Duke of Wrenford was mortgaged to the slates of his own roof. He held one of the oldest names in England and could not have raised £3,000 in ready coin against the whole of Wrenford Court, the house his family had kept for 200 years, the Long Gallery, the famous painted ceilings, the park with its black winter oaks. His grandfather had gamed the liquid money away, and his father had let the debt sleep and grow, and now the interest ate the estate alive from beneath, the way water eats a foundation. The Duke had one hope of keeping the house that carried his name, and it was not economy, which he had never practiced. It was a rich marriage, and the richest thing within his reach, that autumn, had been the sole and beloved companion of the very woman who, though he had no notion of it, already owned his debt. For the Dowager Countess of Wexley was very old, very rich, and very nearly blind, and she was a great deal cleverer than the county gave her credit for. Widowed 40 years, childless, she had spent a long life quietly buying up things that prouder people were too vain to know they had sold, and among them bought through a discreet man of business named Cathcart, and a chain of names that led nowhere near her own were the mortgages on Wrenford Court. She had not bought them to ruin the Duke, but because she had watched her Grace. For so she called her, my Grace, come to care, quietly and hopelessly, for the magnificent young man next door, and a childless woman may be forgiven for wishing to lay the world at the feet of the one creature who had made her last years bearable. She meant, on the day he married Grace Ellsworth, to burn every paper in that black tin box as a wedding gift, and say nothing, and let the proud boy believe he had saved himself. Grace Ellsworth was 23, brown-haired and quiet, with steady gray eyes and a stillness that unsettled loud people, and she had been poor all her life without once being small. She was the orphan of a curate, the Reverend Mr. Ellsworth, dead of a winter fever when she was 17, who had left her no money at all, and one thing better than money. He had taught her to read, as though reading were a kind of courage. Read it to the end, Grace, he used to say, even the page that wounds you. A thing half read is a lie. She read to the Dowager Countess 3 hours every evening, and because the old woman's eyes had failed, Grace also read and wrote every letter and lease and account of the Wexley fortune, so that not a figure in the whole of it had not passed through her quiet hands. She read weather and faces the way her father had taught her to read a page, once completely, to the end, and never afterward mistaken. The courtship had begun the way such things begin, when a poor man wants a rich woman's favor, sideways, and for the wrong reason. Wrenford had come to Wexley Hall to charm the old countess, because everyone knew she doted on her companion and would dower the girl handsomely, and a duke who married the dowager's darling would find her purse open ever after. He had not expected the companion herself. He had expected a plain drudge, and had found instead a quiet woman who listened as though listening were a skill, and who answered his cleverness without once flattering it. He was 31, and had been flattered since the cradle, and the novelty of not being flattered went to his head like wine. He courted her in what a man like that mistakes for earnest, and one evening in the Wexley library, with the old countess nodding by the fire as witness, he took Grace Ellsworth's hand and told her he would make her his duchess. It was as near to a vow as such a man had ever come, and she believed it, because she had been raised by a man who kept his word, and did not yet know that most men do not. The turn came in November, and it came, as such turns do, with a larger fortune and a colder heart. Miss Arabella Danvers was 23, handsome in the hard, bright way of women who have never once been refused anything. And she was reputed the greatest heiress to come north in a generation, the sole expectant of her late guardian's estate, a nabob's fortune said to run to £80,000. That the whole of it was frozen in a chancery suit, Danvers against Danvers, tangled past untangling, and perhaps past her ever touching a shilling of it, the North did not trouble to learn. Because £80,000 is a sum people would rather believe in than examine. Her father had steered her at Wrenford the way a gunner lays a gun, for he wanted the oldest coronet in the county, and did not care that it sat on a mortgaged head. And Miss Danvers looked once at the Duke's famous name and his famous ceilings, and once at the quiet grey companion he had been fool enough to promise himself to, and set about taking him with the serene appetite of a woman who has never been told no. He could not bear it, and that was the whole of it. Not greed alone, though he was greedy, and not cruelty for its own sake, but the plain unbearable shame of being seen to marry the hired company. He lay awake in his cold, magnificent house, and heard, in advance, the county laughing, the great Duke of Wrenford, brought so low he must wed an old woman's paid reader for the crumbs of her mistress's purse. Against that shame the Danvers fortune shone like rescue, a fortune that would lift the debt off Wrenford at a stroke, and set him up again as the first man in the North, married not to a servant, but to an heiress the clubs would envy. He told himself Grace would understand, that a penniless girl could not truly have expected a coronet, that the thing he had said in the library had been the wine and the winter, and not a vow at all. A man can talk himself into anything at 3 a.m, if the thing he wants is waiting on the other side of it. And so it came to the Christmas ball at Wrenford, and the whole county came to hear a name. Grace came too, in the Dowager Countess's carriage, in her one good gown of grey silk, with a small locket at her throat, her father's, with a curl of his grey hair inside it, the only jewel she owned, because his Grace himself had asked that she attend, and because she still believed, that winter, that a promise was a firm thing, and not a fashion a man might change with the weather. She did not know, coming up the blazing stair, that Miss Arabella Danvers already stood at the head of the ballroom in white satin and diamonds, with her hand on the Duke's arm as though it had grown there. The Duke had drunk enough to make the thing easy, and when the music paused between the sets and the room turned to him for the name it had come to hear, he gave it. "My friends," he said, in the carrying voice his family had bred into their sons for 200 years, "you have come to wish me joy, and you shall. Miss Arabella Danvers has consented to be my duchess." And in the roar of astonishment and pleasure that broke over the room, the surge toward the diamonds, the Danvers father's red triumphant face, he found, because some devil of shame wanted a witness, the still gray figure standing by the black windows, and he spoke to her across the turning heads. Lower, but not nearly low enough. "You did not truly mistake my meaning, Miss Ellsworth? A duke keeps his word to his equals. You were paid to read to her ladyship, not to marry me. Go back to your mistress. She will want her book." And 300 people heard it, and those who did not hear it had it repeated to them behind a fan before the dancing began again, and the county had its joke to carry home through the snow. Grace Ellsworth did not flush, and did not sway, and did not look at the floor. She would remember all her life the smell of hot wax and crushed lilies, and the particular sound 300 people make when they are delighted by someone else's fall. She looked at him once, steadily, the way her father had taught her to read the last hard page of a book, completely, to the end, without skipping the part that wounds. And she said, in a voice that carried further than she meant, because the room had gone quiet to hear her break, "You have taught me something tonight, your grace, that my own father never could. He always swore there was no man so poor as one who breaks his word, and I did not believe him, for I had never seen it done. I have seen it now. I hope Miss Danvers reads you sooner than I did." Then she made him no curtsy. She took up her own shawl, because no footman moved to help her, and walked the length of that blazing room and down the long stair, and out into the clean falling snow, and the doors of Wrenford Court closed behind the only person in it who had told the Duke the truth. On the table by the window where she had stood, she left one small thing, a book he had given her in the first weeks of the courtship, a fine morocco-bound volume with a line written in his own hand on the flyleaf, to Grace, who reads truer than any woman in England. She set it down without a sound as she went, and it was there in the morning when the servants swept out the wax, and a footman brought it to the Duke, who put it in a locked drawer, meaning to send it back to her, and did not, and spent the next year unable to make his hand do it. In the carriage going home through the black and white lanes, she did not weep. The Dowager Countess had waited up, a shawl over her knees, and her blind eyes turned to the door. And when she heard the whole of it, from Grace's steady voice, she was silent a long moment, and then she said a thing in a tone her servants had not heard in 30 years. "Send for Cathcart in the morning, Grace, early." And Grace said, "My lady, I am not hurt as you think. Do not do anything for my sake tonight that the morning will regret." And the old woman reached out with the sure hand of the blind, and found Grace's face, and held it. "My dear," she said, "I have never once done a thing for your sake that I regretted, and I do not mean to begin by doing nothing. Go to bed. The magnificent boy has just made the worst bargain of his life, and does not know it yet, and I am too old and too fond of you to let him off it." What the Duke had entirely failed to reckon with, in the warmth of his diamonds and his rescue, was arithmetic. And arithmetic was the one thing in the world the Dowager Countess of Wexley trusted more than she trusted men. Within the week Mr. Cathcart came down through the snow, with his black tin box, and in the Wexley library. With the fire built high and 2 footmen and the parson to witness it, the old countess did the things she had been turning over since the night of the ball. She gave Grace Ellsworth everything. Not by a will to be argued over when she was gone, but there and then, in her own lifetime and by deed, the Wexley fortune, the funds, the plate, the house, and the black tin box that held the mortgages on Wrenford Court, all of it made over absolutely to Grace, and to Grace alone. "I am naming you what you have been these 6 years, the old woman said, "my daughter in everything but the word. And now the word too." And Grace, who had read 1,000 documents aloud in that room, sat and heard her own name read to her as the owner of the debt on the house where she had been called the hired company, and did not feel the triumph the parson plainly expected. She felt her father in the room, and the strange weight of a thing owned that had been meant once as a gift of love, and had become instead the exact measure of a man's undoing. And here the story must do the thing a tale of two lives in one hard winter must do, and look for a while through the other window. The Duke of Wrenford's rescue went the way of all rescues built on other people's money. Miss Arabella Danvers glittered on his arm through Christmas and into the new year, radiant and expensive, right up until the gray February morning her father's people were pressed to name the day and settle the sum. And it was discovered, gently, and then not gently, that the great Danvers fortune was not a fortune at all, but a lawsuit. That the £80,000 had been frozen in chancery these 9 years in a suit that might run 9 more, that the money had always been in law and never in hand, and Miss Danvers could no more lay it on the dead of Wrenford than on the moon. The Duke had thrown away a promise for a fortune, and the fortune was a rumor. Worse, for a proud man, the whole county knew it by Lady Day, and the joke went round the card-rooms in a form that turned his own cruelty against him. Wrenford, they said, had let the true coin go and married the counterfeit, had sent the reader away and kept the lawsuit. He heard it. Proud men hear everything they pretend not to. And at night, in a great cold house he could no longer afford to light past the first landing. His mind went back and back against his will to a still gray figure by a black window, and a quiet voice saying, "I hope Miss Danvers reads you sooner than I did." He had begun, without admitting it, to be haunted by the plainest woman he had ever insulted. By March, the sleeping debt woke. The interest fell due that no rumor could pay, and the men who had held the Wrenford mortgages so quietly for so long now wanted their money or their security, and the Duke's dry agent, Mr. Purcell, laid the truth before him without mercy. "Your Grace cannot borrow further," he said. "There is not a bank in the north will lend on Wrenford, now the Danvers match is known for what it is. The whole of the debt stands in one hand, and it is called. If your Grace wishes to keep the roof over the gallery, he must go to the holder of the paper, ask for time, and beg it like any other man." And when the Duke demanded to know what single hand in England held the whole of Wrenford, mistress, Purcell told him the name, and the Duke sat down. He went in the last week of March, because pride starves slower than an estate, and a duke with a great name and no ready money cannot eat the name. He went to Wexley Hall to throw himself on the mercy of the old countess, whom he still imagined as a doting blind woman he might charm, and he was shown not into the drawing-room, but into the library, the long quiet room where he had once, with the fire low and the old woman nodding, told a curate's daughter he would make her a duchess. The fire was high now. The great desk that had always stood empty was covered edge to edge with ledgers and leases and a black tin box, and behind it, a pen in her hand and her father's steel spectacles pushed up into her brown hair, sat Grace Ellsworth. The Duke of Wrenford, who had walked into rooms for 31 years and found them arranging themselves around him, stopped on the threshold of that one as though he had walked into cold glass, and for the first time in his life, a winter and a lifetime too late, really looked at her. He looked, and could not stop looking, and what he saw had been standing by his black window all along. The stillness that was not meekness, but a great strength held quiet. The gray eyes that measured a man the way they measured a column of figures. The plainness that was not plainness at all, but a lamp that had burned steadily in a room too bright for anyone to notice it was lit. He heard, from a distance of one winter, his own carrying voice, saying you were paid to read to her, not to marry me. And he understood, with the cold at his knees, exactly whom he had held out his hand to, and then sent back to fetch a book. "Your Grace," said Grace Ellsworth, not rising. "You have come about Wrenford. Sit down." "Her ladyship no longer manages these affairs. I do. It will not take long." He sat. Cathcart was there, and a clerk, and it was all done in the open, on the desk, in figures. And this was the thing that undid the Duke and kept undoing him for months after. She was scrupulously, immaculately fair. He had come braced for the knife, for the slow revenge a wronged woman is owed, and she gave him accounts, time on the interest at the common rate any tenant might ask, not a farthing of vengeance added to a figure. When Cathcart murmured that the arrears might justly be pressed harder against a duke who had used her so, Grace said, without looking up, "We charge his grace what the money costs, and not a penny more, Mr. Cathcart. We do not raise the figure because the man is a duke, any more than we would lower it because the man is sorry. He is neither owed a punishment nor spared one. He owes what the paper says." And she pushed the fair agreement across the desk with her own hand, and signed it, and it was, he thought afterward, the most terrible thing that had ever been done to him, and it was only justice. He sat with the pen in his hand and could not, for a moment, use it. "Why?" he said at last, low, not to Cathcart, not to the clerk, only to her. "You hold the whole of my house in that box. You might have turned me into the road this morning, and every soul in the county would have called it justice. Why these terms, and not the ones you might have set?" She looked at him across the desk, and her voice, when it came, was even and unhurried, and struck him harder than any fury could have done. "Because I read to the end. Your Grace. My father taught me that you read the whole page, even the part that wounds you, and you do not tear it out. The true figure of what you owe is on that paper. It is exact. It is neither more nor less than the truth, and the truth is the only thing I was ever paid and that did not run out. Sign, please," he signed. At the door he could not help it. A winter of 3 in the morning honesty forced it up out of him. He turned. "Miss Ellsworth, what I said at my own ball before my own people. That is not on the agreement, Your Grace," she said, already drawing the next paper toward her. "Regret does not reduce the interest. Good day to you." And he went out into the snow with his hat in his hand. A duke dismissed by a woman fetching not a book now, but a whole estate, and could not for the life of him remember why the dismissal did not feel like cruelty, when it had every right to. He began to come to Wexley on the quarter days after that, to sit in the plain outer room among the tenants and tradesmen waiting his turn. The great Duke of Wrenford, with his hat on his knee, and hear, through the door, the level voice conducting a great fortune with the exactness of a woman who would answer for every figure of it to God. Once he watched her catch her own steward patting the Wrenford arrears by £40. "His Grace is charged here for a quarter already paid. The estate does not keep what it has not earned," and pushed the corrected figure back across the desk in his favor with her own bare hand, and he walked out to his horse and stood a long while in the cold, unable to remember why he had come out to it. It would have been easier, he thought, if she had robbed him. A man can hate a creditor who cheats him. There is no armor in a proud man's whole wardrobe against being treated by the woman he wronged past mending, with perfect exactness and not one grain of spite. He began, clumsily, at 31, and for the first time in his life unpurchased and unadmired, to court her again, this time in what may even have been earnest. Hothouse Flowers went to Wexley, and came back the same evening with a civil line. "Miss Ellsworth does not receive flowers at a place of business, which her ladyship's library has become." He sent the book back at last, the morocco volume with his own hand on the flyleaf, and had it returned unopened with 3 words in an even rule of a hand. "Kept nothing, sir," and in April. When Miss Arabella Danvers, freed of him the moment his ruin was plain, her father's chancery suit now the joke of 2 counties, married a stout, rich cotton master out of the mills, and was heard to say brilliantly at her wedding breakfast that a coronet was a very fine thing, but she did like a husband who could pay for the candles, the Duke of Wrenford was almost past wincing. Almost, he wrote her a letter at last, the honest one, 4 pages of it at 3 in the morning, the splinter drawn out with both hands. that he had thrown her over not for Arabella Danvers's beauty, nor even her rumored fortune, but out of the plain unbearable shame of being seen to want the hired company, that he had known, even as he said the words, that she was the one true thing in the room, and the diamonds the counterfeit, that there was a book he had meant for a year to send back, and could not make his hand release. That he had read, at last, the page in himself he had spent his whole life tearing out. To all 4 pages she sent back a single line, in that same even rule of a hand, Your Grace, I am glad you have read it to the end at last. It is late, and it changes nothing on the agreement. G.E. The interest could not be paid, and no rumor or letter could hold off the plain figure at the bottom of the page. When the last quarter came and went, and the Wrenford debt stood exactly where it had always stood, the whole of the house came, by the law's own quiet machinery, to the holder of the paper. Grace did not send the sheriff's men. She took Wrenford Court in settlement of the debt, cleanly and in her own name. And then she did the things that told the county precisely who had come to own it. She kept on every servant to the last scullery hand. At wages raised, she settled a life annuity and the dower house upon the Duke's aged mother, who had never done her any wrong, and wept when she was told. And she gave orders that the long gallery and the famous ceilings be mended before winter. Because a beautiful thing, she said, ought not to be punished for the sins of the man who neglected it. She had learned that from her father, too, that you do not tear out the good page because the reader was a fool. And so it came, in the first snow of the new December, to the day the county still tells of. The Duke of Wrenford, a duke of nothing now, a great name over an empty purse, his house another's, his heiress another man's wife, came back to Wrenford Court one last time, to give up the keys of the only home his family had ever known into the hands of the woman he had called the hired company. The new mistress of Wrenford had chosen to receive the handing over, as the old dukes had received their tenants, in the great ballroom, under the mended ceilings, with the fire high and the tall windows full of falling snow, and a room of witnesses, the Dowager Countess in her chair by the fire, blind and upright and fierce as a queen, Cathcart, the parson, the upper servants, and a scattering of the same county faces that had chuckled behind their fans a year before. He had meant, they said afterward, to be dignified. He came in plainly dressed, and bowed to her, and began upon the formal words of the surrender of the house. And then, in the middle of them, at the exact spot by the tall black windows where she had once stood to hear herself called a servant, something in the magnificent ruined man simply gave way. He stopped. He looked at her, gray-gowned no longer, for she wore that day a deep gown the color of dark garnet, the first color anyone in the county had ever seen on her, with her father's small locket at her throat, and he went down, both knees, on the floor of the ballroom that had been his family's for 200 years and was hers. Miss Ellsworth, he said, and his family's carrying voice did not fail him even then. A year ago, in this room, before these same people, I broke my word to you and called you a thing that was paid for. Every soul who laughed with me that night can hear me now. I cannot unsay it, I have tried. A man cannot. I am asking you, on my knees, in the house you have every right to turn me out of, to be my wife, and to let me spend what is left of my life earning back the word I threw away. I have nothing to offer you. That is the truth, and I have learned from you that the truth is the only coin worth the name. I am asking you anyway. The silence that came down had a texture to it. People said afterward you could feel it on the skin. Somewhere in the great cold house a clock struck. Somewhere the snow touched the tall glass and slid. And Grace Ellsworth looked down at the kneeling Duke a long level moment, and those nearest swore ever after that there was no triumph in her face at all, none. And that this was the terrible thing about it. She looked at him the way she read the last page of a hard book, once, completely, to the end, taking the true measure of what was there. "Stand up, your grace," she said at last, and her quiet carried to the far wall, because the whole room was helping it. "I will not have any man kneel to me in this house. Too much has been asked already of the people who kneel in it." He rose, unsteady, and she went on, gently, which was worse than any anger could have been. "You have asked me to be your wife. A year ago I would have given my life for those words, and you knew it, and you used it, and then you spent it before 300 people. I have read you to the end now, your grace, the whole of you, the fine pages and the one you tear out, and I believe you are sorry, truly, and I am glad of it, for your soul's sake. But I have learned what your word is worth in the one currency I was ever paid in, and it will not buy me. I forgave you a long while ago. Forgiveness was never the question. The question was whether I would ever again set my whole life in the hands of a man who let a room full of people watch him drop it. And the answer, your grace, is no." There was a small, dreadful pause, and then the Dowager Countess of Wexley spoke from her chair by the fire, without turning her blind eyes, in the carrying voice of a woman who had waited a full year for the pleasure. "They called you His Grace all your life," she said, "and you never once knew what the word meant. She has it. She always had it. That is the whole of the difference between the two of you, and it is why the house is hers. Now get up off her floor." Grace crossed to the tall window, and stood looking out at the snow, and did not watch him rise, and did not watch him gather the last of himself together and bow, once to the room, and go. She had read him to the end. There was no page left to turn, and she had never in her life pretended a book was longer than it was. From the tall window of the ballroom, the very glass she had stood beside a year before, on the night he taught her what her father never could, Grace Ellsworth watched the Duke of Wrenford's carriage come round on the snow-covered sweep and carry him away down the long white drive between the black winter oaks, smaller and smaller, until the falling snow closed over it and the drive was only snow again. She did not weep for him. She had done her weeping a year before, in a hired carriage in the dark, and had read since to the end of that grief, as she read to the end of everything, and come out on the far side of it, where the quiet is. The Dowager Countess found her there by the window, with the old sure hand of the blind, and stood beside her, and the two of them watched the snow come down over the drive and the park and the mended roof of the house that was theirs. "He is gone, my dear," the old woman said. "He is," said Grace, watching the last of the wheel marks fill. "He is gone now." That is the account, entire, of Julian, 4th Duke of Wrenford, who was offered a faithful woman and a fortune meant in love, and held out his hand instead for a rumor and a colder name, who called the truest person in the county a thing that was paid for, because he could not bear to be seen to want her, and who lost the heiress, the fortune, the house his family had held 200 years, and the woman, all in a single turning year, to nothing more violent than arithmetic and a broken word. She had read him to the end, and found him at last sincere, and let him go anyway, because some words, once dropped before 300 people, cannot be picked up again, and she had been raised by a man who never dropped one. The carriage went down the drive. The snow closed over the marks. And that, in the North Country, is what they mean when they say a man has been well and truly undone. If this story of a proud duke and the quiet woman who read him true held you all the way to the last of the snow, do a kind thing for the storytellers. Press the like button and share it with a fellow lover of grounded historical romance and deeply drawn slow-burn drama. Subscribe to The Duke's Undoing so you never miss the next chapter of a proud man learning, too late or almost too late, exactly what he threw away. And tell us below, for we read every answer. When he knelt in the house he had lost and begged her to take him back, was she right to let his carriage go? Or should some words be forgivable, even the ones said before 300 people?